The late afternoon sun cast a golden warmth over the cobblestone square in downtown New Haven, where the shadows of history clung quietly to every corner. The tall clock tower above City Hall chimed 5, its steady tone drifting over the trees and brick facades, like a reminder that the day, though elegant, was drawing to a close. Eleanor Brooks stood alone at the edge of the marble steps, her figure still poised despite the ache in her knees. She had spent the last 4 hours inside the Grand Hall, attending a civic symposium honoring educators and civil rights pioneers. At 78, Eleanor had come not seeking recognition, but out of habit, a lifelong instinct to show up, to witness, to add her presence to the weight of dignity. She wore a soft gray blazer with a deep blue silk scarf looped neatly at her collar. Her silver hair was pinned into a graceful twist. Though time had slowed her stride, her eyes remained sharp, full of thought memory and silent rebellion. In one hand, she held a modest leather clutch. In the other, her phone. She had just dialed her son. He was supposed to pick her up personally, he had insisted. "No rideshare apps, Mom. I'll be there," he'd said that morning, his voice steady with the kind of assurance only someone who had once led rescue teams behind enemy lines could give. Jackson Brooks, 45, a former Navy SEAL turned security strategist, didn't make empty promises. As the call rang, Eleanor took a breath and looked out toward the boulevard. Cars drifted by slowly in the afternoon lull. Birds circled lazily overhead. A breeze moved through the oak trees lining the block, fluttering the fabric of her scarf gently against her cheek. She didn't see the black and white patrol car parked across the street. She didn't see the man inside watching her. But Officer Reed Dalton saw everything. He watched as Eleanor ended the call and tucked her phone away. Watched as she adjusted the strap of her bag. Watched as she stood tall in her solitude. His hand gripped a half-drunk coffee, but his jaw was tighter than his grip. His eyes didn't register a retired professor. They didn't see history in her quiet stance or courage in her calm. They saw something else, something he had been conditioned to distrust. She didn't belong here, not on these steps, not in this part of town, not dressed like that, not standing like she had a right. Dalton had been assigned to the perimeter for the event, a routine crowd control detail. But the crowd had long gone, and now his presence was more about posture than protection. And posture, in his mind, was everything. He got out of the car. Eleanor heard the car door close and glanced sideways. The man approaching her wore the uniform of law enforcement, but there was something in his walk that felt less like duty and more like ownership. She offered a polite nod, the kind worn thin by decades of practice. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "are you waiting for someone?" "I am," she replied, her tone neutral but firm. "My son." He studied her face like a riddle. "You sure you're not lost?" She smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I was invited here. I'm right where I'm meant to be." Dalton's lips curled ever so slightly. "Mind if I see some ID?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Just standard procedure," he said, though it wasn't. "I see," she murmured, her voice still composed. "Well, officer, unless you have a specific reason, I don't believe you have the right to demand identification." A pause, the kind that makes the world hold its breath. His fingers brushed the edge of his belt, her fingers held tighter to her purse. From across the plaza, no one noticed. To most, it was just an elderly woman and a cop talking on the steps. But something was shifting, not in the air, but in the silence between them. And in that moment, neither of them moved. But the balance of power had already started to tilt. Eleanor Brooks didn't flinch. She'd seen this kind of man before, uniformed, self-important, a badge pressed onto his chest like a crown, eager to find in her presence a reason for authority. She remembered them from the lunch counters, the buses, the marches. The names changed, the years passed, but the tone, the posture, the suspicion, they remained. Officer Reed Dalton shifted his weight, now towering just a foot away from her. The sun cast a long shadow from his figure across the steps, cutting her in half like a threat without a blade. "You're loitering," he said. "I'm standing," Eleanor replied. He tilted his head slightly, a smirk beginning to tug at the corner of his mouth. "Depends on how you define it." "I define it," she said quietly, "by legality." Dalton took a step closer. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to open your purse." "No," she answered without hesitation. His smirk vanished. "Excuse me?" "I said no, you don't have a cause. You don't have a warrant. You have suspicion. And frankly, that's your burden to carry." She began to turn away, her hand reaching once more into her purse to retrieve her phone. Her fingers trembled only slightly. Not from fear, but from the rage that came with memory. She had survived too many indignities to surrender to this one. But Reed saw something else. In her refusal, he saw a challenge. In her composure, he saw defiance. And in her dignity, he saw the unraveling of control. His voice dropped to a whisper, laced with venom. "Lady, people like you don't usually get invited to things like this. So forgive me if I don't buy your story." She turned slowly. "People like me," she echoed. "Educators, citizens, mothers, survivors." He stepped forward, too close now. "Watch the attitude. You watch your assumptions." There was no shout, no siren, no sudden crowd, just the sound of his breath tightening and the cold click of authority slipping into rage. She turned again, this time not in defiance, but because she believed, naively perhaps, that it was done, that he would walk away, that decency, or at least protocol, would pull him back. She lifted the phone to her ear again and pressed Jackson's name. But it rang and rang and rang. Then came the blow. It wasn't theatrical. There was no warning. Just a sharp crack of flesh against cheekbone, the kind of sound that breaks more than skin. It breaks silence, illusions, and bystander comfort. Eleanor's body recoiled, her head whipped to the side. A gasp escaped her lips, not of pain, but disbelief. For a heartbeat, she stood frozen in place. Then her knees gave out, and she crumpled, one hand catching the pavement, the other still clutching the phone. From across the street, someone shouted, "Hey, what the hell?" Dalton stood over her, unshaken, unbothered. "You resisted," he said, his voice cold, mechanical. "I resisted a tyrant," Eleanor hissed, one hand against her face. People began to gather. A young woman with curly hair and a laptop bag stopped in her tracks. Two college students held out their phones. A middle-aged man across the square lifted his camera. The moment had become irreversible. Recorded, witnessed, archived. Dalton's hand hovered near his holster, not for his weapon, but for leverage. "I need to search her bag," he barked. "Possible theft. Suspicious behavior." "Suspicious of what?" a bystander yelled. "She's 78, someone else shouted. "She was standing there waiting." But Dalton was no longer listening. He bent down, grabbed Eleanor's bag roughly from where it had fallen, and yanked it open. Eleanor tried to rise. Her voice, though raspy from the impact, carried sharp and clear. "That's my property." He pulled out her wallet, held it up like a trophy. "Standard procedure," he said. "You're going to lose your job," she spat through gritted teeth, blood rising beneath the skin of her cheek. Dalton's eyes flicked around now, noticing the phones, the cameras, the silence in the air that was no longer his to command. And then, the screech of tires. A black SUV pulled up fast and hard, the engine cut. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in a dark tactical coat, boots landing on the pavement with controlled precision. His posture was calm, his expression unreadable, but his presence hit like a thunderclap. Jackson Brooks had arrived. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sidewalk knew. The crowd knew. And Officer Dalton, he was about to learn what it meant to strike a woman who raised a soldier. Jackson Brooks didn't walk. He advanced. Each step was measured, deliberate, heavy with the kind of stillness that made even the breeze hesitate. The crowd instinctively parted like grass under a rolling storm cloud. Conversations fell away. The sound of camera shutters and traffic dulled. Even Officer Dalton froze for a fraction of a second as the figure approached. The broad-shouldered man, with eyes like stone and a stare honed in war zones far more dangerous than any city square. Dalton's hand dropped from Eleanor's purse. Jackson's eyes didn't even glance at him at first. He went to his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice low and steady, like a steady current beneath ice. Eleanor looked up from the pavement, her cheeks swollen, her dignity still intact. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She only placed a hand on her son's arm and said 4 words. "He struck me, Jackson." The air changed, no shouting, no fury, just a quiet seismic shift beneath the surface. Jackson slowly rose to his full height. His face didn't contort. His muscles didn't twitch. He didn't posture like Officer Dalton had. Instead, his silence became the loudest thing on that street. Dalton took a half step back, then quickly masked it with bravado. "Sir, you need to stand down." "You hit my mother," Jackson said, not raising his voice. "That woman was obstructing an investigation." "There was no investigation," Jackson replied, still calm. "Only a man with a badge mistaking it for a crown." Dalton reached for his radio. "I'll have you detained for interfering with police." That was when Jackson moved. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, grabbed the front of Dalton's uniform, and yanked him off balance. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't theatrical. It was efficient, like a switchblade clicking open. Dalton stumbled, arms flailing, and Jackson pinned him against the side of his patrol car, the metal groaning under the sudden impact. The officer gasped, but Jackson held him fast with one arm, like steel forged from restraint. "Look at her," Jackson said, his voice now sharp. "Look at what you did." Dalton tried to turn away, but Jackson gripped his chin and forced him to face the woman still sitting upright on the pavement. "She's a professor. She gave her life to this country's children. She marched before you were born, and you struck her because your ego couldn't handle her refusal." Dalton writhed, trying to push back. "You're assaulting an officer." "I'm defending my mother." With that, Jackson released him, but only for a second. Dalton lunged forward, swinging blindly. Jackson sidestepped. The punch missed completely. Then came the counterstrike. Jackson's palm caught Dalton's chest like a hammer of justice, sending the officer crashing backward against the hood with a painful grunt. He slumped, dazed, his pride more shattered than his ribs. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in vindication, applause, cheers, voices crying out, "That's what justice looks like. She raised a warrior. Protect our elders." But Jackson didn't turn to the crowd. He stepped back to his mother, knelt beside her again, and softly said, "Let's get you up." Eleanor nodded, accepting his hand, rising with quiet grace as someone from the crowd handed her back her purse. Another placed a water bottle into her hand. The community, silent moments ago, now pulsed around her with reverence. And just as Jackson turned to shield her from further harm, the sirens began. 2 patrol cruisers screeched to a halt at the corner. Doors flew open. 4 officers emerged, hands near their weapons but not drawn. "What's going on here?" one demanded, scanning the crowd, then freezing the moment his gaze landed on the dazed Dalton slumped against his car, and on Jackson Brooks, whose face now matched the one flooding social media feeds. The second officer, younger and sharper-eyed, turned to the crowd. "Did anyone record what happened?" Dozens of hands lifted phones, voices rose again. "He hit her first. She was just waiting for her son." Everything's on video. The senior officer looked at Jackson. Sir, we're going to need you to stay and give a statement. Jackson nodded once. I'll stay, but get someone to check on my mother. The paramedics were already being waved forward by a woman in the crowd. As they approached, Eleanor leaned against her son and whispered, You didn't just arrive on time. You arrived exactly when the truth needed you. Jackson didn't answer. He only looked at the man still crumpled on the ground, and then at the cameras capturing every frame. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The footage spread faster than a rumor. Within hours, the confrontation outside City Hall had made its way from street corners to national headlines. News anchors dissected it. Advocacy groups amplified it. Comment sections lit up with praise, outrage, disbelief, and vindication. The hashtags had Brooks stand in #justice for Eleanor began trending by nightfall. But Jackson Brooks wasn't watching the screens. He was sitting quietly in a hospital corridor beside his mother's room, arms folded across his chest, his face carved from stillness. Inside the room, Eleanor lay resting, a bandage now covering the dark swell on her cheekbone. Her vitals were stable, no fractures, no concussion, just bruising, external and beneath the surface. When the door creaked open, Jackson stood immediately. Sergeant Marla Hendricks from Internal Affairs stepped inside, followed by a representative from the district attorney's office, a young woman named Claire Monroe with a voice as precise as her notes. Mr. Brooks, she said after a brief nod, will be pressing charges against Officer Reed Dalton by morning. Assault, misconduct, abuse of authority. Jackson said nothing at first. Then, will he be arrested or placed on desk duty again? He's already in custody, Claire replied. The footage made that unavoidable. Eleanor stirred from the bed, her voice soft but unmistakable. Will I need to testify? Claire stepped forward. It would strengthen the case, but only if you were ready. Eleanor opened her eyes, met Jackson's gaze, and then Claire's. I've been ready for 60 years. 2 days later, the courthouse steps were lined with reporters, microphones, and crowds holding hand-painted signs. Accountability now. Justice has no age. We are all Eleanor. Inside, the courtroom was colder, quieter, but no less charged. The judge, a lean, silver-haired man with sharp eyes, presided with the weight of national attention on his gavel. The gallery was full. The camera crews weren't allowed inside, but dozens of spectators were. Rosa, the young woman who had helped Eleanor that day, sat in the second row. When Reed Dalton entered in handcuffs, the hush was palpable. He no longer looked cocky. He looked small, his badge gone, his uniform stripped, his arrogance undone. Claire Monroe stood. The state charges Officer Reed Dalton with third-degree assault, official misconduct, and abuse of authority in connection with the unprovoked physical attack on civilian Eleanor Brooks. The judge nodded, barely glancing at the defense table. Does the defense wish to respond? Dalton's lawyer, a pale man in an expensive suit, rose. Your Honor, we intend to argue that Officer Dalton was responding to what he perceived as suspicious behavior. My client acted under the stress of duty in a complex urban environment. Save it, the judge cut in calmly. We've all seen the footage. We've read the transcripts. Unless you intend to argue that assaulting a 78-year-old woman is protocol, I suggest you shorten your defense. The room tensed. Dalton's lawyer sat. Claire turned to face the gallery. With the court's permission, we'd like to allow brief testimony from Ms. Brooks and Mr. Jackson Brooks. The judge gestured. Proceed. Eleanor stepped forward slowly with the aid of a cane. The moment she took the stand, the room leaned forward. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I've spent my life teaching others how to think critically and act justly, she said. I never imagined I'd live long enough to be struck down by the very system I helped build faith in. She paused. But that's what happened. Not because I was a threat, not because I resisted, but because I stood still. And that stillness made a man like Reed Dalton feel small. Then came Jackson. He didn't wear a suit, just a dark jacket, plain shirt, and the bearing of someone who knew how to face danger without flinching. I didn't hit a cop, he began. I stopped a man from hitting my mother again. He turned to the defense table. And if your badge tells you that's okay, that bruising an old woman is part of your stress response, then this country has deeper wounds than I feared. The judge leaned back, and in the space between their testimonies and his ruling, there was a silence deeper than any legal argument. Then came the sentence. Officer Reed Dalton will be remanded without bail pending formal trial. Based on overwhelming evidence and eyewitness testimony, this court deems him a threat to public safety. The gavel struck. The gallery exhaled. Justice had spoken, not just for Eleanor, but for everyone who had ever stood still and been seen as dangerous. The trial had ended, but something else had just begun. It had been 3 weeks since Officer Reed Dalton was convicted on 3 counts: third-degree assault, abuse of authority, and obstruction. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, stripped of his badge, barred from ever serving in law enforcement again. But for Eleanor Brooks, justice had never simply been about a prison term. It was about what came next, after the headlines faded, after the applause died down, after people moved on. She was sitting on her front porch now, wrapped in a light shawl against the cool spring breeze. The bruises on her face had softened into shadows, reminders that the skin can heal faster than memory. A mug of chamomile tea sat beside her, untouched, its warmth rising like hope. Across from her sat Jackson, calm but changed. The same strength was there, the same silent protectiveness, but something in his eyes had shifted. He had never sought attention. He didn't care for media clips, online praise, or hashtags. But he did care that his mother could sit on this porch without fear. That was enough. You're quiet, Eleanor said, watching him. I've been thinking, he replied, about how fast it all happened, about what didn't happen sooner. She nodded. Justice moves slowly, but sometimes, when it comes, it echoes. A soft knock sounded at the front gate. Jackson stood automatically, but Eleanor raised a hand gently. Let her in, she said. It was Rosa, the young woman who had helped Eleanor to her feet after the assault, who had offered her water and stayed through every court hearing since. She was carrying a slim folder and a hopeful smile. I hope I'm not intruding, Rosa said, stepping onto the porch. Not at all, dear, Eleanor said, gesturing to the spare chair beside her. Rosa sat, opened the folder, and placed a small stack of printed documents on the table. It's happening, she said. Jackson leaned forward. What is? The city council just passed a resolution, Rosa said, her voice trembling slightly. They're calling it the Eleanor Act. Jackson raised his eyebrows. Eleanor blinked, stunned. It mandates body cameras for all local officers, automatic public release of footage during civilian complaints, and independent review boards with citizen seats. Your case, it pushed it forward. Eleanor's fingers rested on the folder gently. They're naming it after me? Rosa nodded. You didn't just survive something terrible. You taught us how to stand up. Jackson looked at his mother, then at the street beyond the porch. That won't fix everything, he said quietly. No, Eleanor agreed, but it's a beginning. They sat for a moment in the late afternoon stillness. Cars passed, birds circled. Somewhere down the block, a child's laugh rose into the air, unburdened. Then Rosa asked, would you consider speaking at the unveiling ceremony next week? Eleanor smiled. Only if Jackson agrees to speak too. Jackson grunted softly. You just want me to wear a suit. No, Eleanor said. I want people to see what it means to have a son who knows when to speak and when to stand, who didn't ask to be a symbol, but became one because he refused to walk away. He looked away, jaw tight, then finally nodded. I'll speak. The day of the ceremony came. No cameras were allowed inside at Eleanor's request. Let them feel it, she'd said, not just film it. When she stepped to the podium, the room fell silent. She spoke not like a victim, but like a witness to a life, a system, and a change finally stirred awake. And when Jackson took the stage after her, he said just one thing. My mother taught me the value of standing still, especially when the world expects you to move out of the way. This law is not about her. It's about everyone who won't get a courtroom, everyone who won't have a son like me, and everyone who's been waiting for someone to care. The applause was quiet, respectful, like the beginning of something sacred. Lesson of the story. When justice fails at the hands of power, it's not always rage that changes the world. Sometimes it's stillness. Sometimes it's a woman standing alone on a sidewalk, refusing to shrink. Sometimes it's a son arriving not to fight, but to remind us what protection looks like when it's done with love, not violence. And sometimes it's one slap that echoes through a system too long protected by silence until someone says, not this time. If you felt something while watching this story, share it. If you believe in dignity and justice, stand up for it, even if you're the only one standing. Like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe because stories like this deserve to be told.